coming to the second part of the question that I asked, Ukraine, and then Russian, invasion of Ukraine, and suddenly there was this whole spate of activity that we've seen China's role. After being a little, kind of taken aback a little bit with the whole attack, I don't think that the Chinese were really fully supportive of Russia opening this front and actually taking a military approach to it. They still, once it happens, after a couple of weeks, Chinese have come out pretty clearly in support of the Russian position on that. And we've seen the impact, a bit of that spillover impact in the region here, especially as far as India is concerned. We saw that quick kind of movement, China moving in to try to fix their really bad security relations with India over the border altercation that happened 2 years ago, and that had really severely damaged relations. And we saw the foreign minister's sudden visit to India, and a very clear, open kind of at least body language of trying to fix things with India. And so and in that context there was also talk about trying to include India, trying to kind of ally Indian objections to CPEC, for example, and how India can probably, this is something that they've said before also, but there is a constant, he went to Kabul and then he went to India. So there has been a little bit of a comment on that here also, the possibilities that these changes where India, China and Russia, despite all the other issues that India and China have on their border, and which Indian external minister was very clear, Jaishankar, that we, just like Pakistan used to say to India, without Kashmir is a core issue and we are not going to discuss anything else with you without discussing Kashmir. He said the same thing to China. First we discuss the border, and first we move a little further on what India wants there. We cannot discuss any larger strategic changes within the region or aligning positions on that. But saying that, do you think there is a possibility of maybe China, Russia, and especially because China, Russia now so in the region involved with Afghanistan and trying to shift things there, and this opening with India and China and Russia at this moment, this juncture, and not a distancing, but it's problematic. The U.S. India relations today, or the India and Europe's relations today on this very core issue look a little problematic as to on Russia. Do you think there's an opening that maybe India could be wooed in to maybe get a little bit involved back into Afghanistan? Do you think that can impact part of that? Because this is something that I've felt now that the Taliban are there, Pakistan's own insecurities of having India on this side of the border should be diminished a little bit. And we've heard our General Bajwa's statement today at the Security Council and that conference, that there also India was mentioned in ways that Pakistan wants to fix its relations. And do you think there can be little bits of changes related to Afghanistan, given in this larger context of Ukraine? And
so there's a few pieces.
I know it's a very big picture, but you can pick and choose little bits of it.
I mean,
have sub questions. Yeah.
I suppose whether you get to a place on Afghanistan through these different kind of pieces fitting together, because I agree with the analysis. I mean, a couple of things. First of all, China was. There's a huge debate about what they knew in advance. What it seems pretty clear is that they thought that whatever the Russians did, they'd be successful, that it would be fast,
quick and out.
So it would either be that the Russians would be able to kind of coerce concessions and kind of achieve their goals without fighting, or that if they did intervene militarily, it would be sort of short, sharp Crimea kind of thing. So they have been surprised, and because there was such a level of public commitment from Xi Jinping with his joint appearance with Putin in the middle of the run-up to this, and then this joint statement, the No Limits joint statement, it's meant that China has been identified in different ways with the consequences of this and has put them under much more pressure than was the case before. This was not something they went through in 2014. But they also, in 2014, were very careful about their positioning. They were genuinely neutral. They kind of nodded a bit in Russia's direction, and ultimately they came in to support them on sanctions issues and otherwise economically. But in practical terms, I think they were seen to be trying to maintain some level of neutrality. They're not this time.
Okay.
And so that's creating a framework where they're facing a lot of pressure from the US. That was happening before in different ways as well, but I think this is different because this is a war on a certain scale and with certain consequences.
A classical, conventional war.
Yeah,
I mean, there's no other way of describing it. It's old-style war.
And just an outright invasion. I mean,
outright invasion,
and so in Europe it is, I mean, you can go back to the Balkan Wars, but this is a nuclear power invading a neighbouring state. So it's treated on a certain scale that there are things that China can kind of play with, but they're under tremendous scrutiny. How far are they providing certain forms of support? How far are they helping Russia evade sanctions? And how far are they, because there was the reports of requests for military support.
But they denied it and they said that
we'll see. I mean, the two have a military relationship that involves weapon sales to each other. In ordinary times, one might have expected that if Russia saw some things that they wanted to get from the Chinese would be willing to sell it. So it's more that this is playing out during a war. So they were, I think, under a certain amount of pressure, and they were really trying to struggle to find their position on this. Position has pretty much swung in along the lines of where Xi Jinping was at. It's all the Americans' fault.
They pushed Russia, and
Russia's put a big because they mirror everything. So it's security alliances, the US seeking absolute security, pushing a big country into the corner, and so what could you expect them to do? And so it's them in Asia, and so they've just mirrored everything on that, and that's the line. It's not clear who this actually lands well with, though. I mean, this is actually alienating their relationships in Europe in particular. But the thing that they are perhaps having a little bit more traction with is the economic fallout from this is profound. The hit to energy prices, but particularly food, wheat, and I mean, this has happened because of the invasion, but the Chinese positioning around this is to blame it on the sanctions, and certainly the sanctions are having ripple effects as well, but the implication is that the wider economic fallout that a lot of countries, particularly across the developing world, are experiencing right now is coming about as a result of sanctions, and that China is able to kind of, in some sense or other, help mitigate the impact. And that certainly, if we're looking at India's in a difficult spot with this, very dependent Russian military kit, need to maintain certain kind of quality of relationship there. We know what Russia is willing to do, and I mean, they were going around warning various countries not to expect that they'd continue to have spare parts and things like this if they took a certain position on this. So I mean, they're pretty clear about how they use this, and India was a little concerned about some of the dynamics that you were seeing. I mean, the concern is if the Russia-China relationship grows too close, that it's going to have real costs for India. And you had a Pakistan angle, of course, as well. More modest, but not unnoticed what was happening in terms of
the China and Russia closeness. I mean, we've seen the shift, the transatlantic, Russia's Atlantist shift, Western facing Atlantist shift over the years for the last, I mean, initially in the 90s, for a short period, there was a power, which it is also, and it's been classically there. But this whole, especially this invasion of of Ukraine and the whole of Europe, literally, and even some of the pro-Soviet Russian states previously, they're all kind of gravitating away from Russia. I mean, there's been a very significantly unified kind of a positioning by almost all other than Belarus, I think, one country which has stood by.
Yes.
It's been a very clear shift where Europe looks to be on one side. It looks like long term, if this continues and the sanctions continue, even if the war ends in Ukraine, Russia and Chinese closeness is likely to grow.
Yeah.
And so the Eurasianism, which has always been this whole streak in Russian politics and Russian, will grow in their view. And that does impact, as you're saying, that India's long-term position, that changes the geopolitics of security and geopolitics around India's own neighborhood, how they view that.
And as you said as well, you had, and I think this was partly in the Chinese thinking on what they were looking to do with Russia. You had, after Afghanistan, and I do think this is where the issues tie together a little bit, Russia, Pakistan, China were kind of, in one sense, core of a certain nexus of countries looking at in the region, dealing with the aftermath on this. I think the sense was, here are three countries that in different ways complement each other's capabilities. If it's just, and in the international diplomatic space, Russia and China working together in a certain way looks different. Russia dealing with some of the Central Asian security issues looks different. I mean, you've got a whole list of reasons why those three countries, if they're able to pull together.
And to just frame it from a geopolitical perspective, Russia and China's own closeness and the level of trust that both these two countries have, they have their differences and issues, but the level of trust has opened that, we talk about CPEC, but the BRI, the real BRI, not from the oceanic BRI, the land BRI, goes through the whole Central Asian belt and goes through the underbelly of Russia into Europe.
And through Russia itself.
Through Russia itself, but also, and that could only be possible for China to have that kind of an extension if it has Russia firmly in that level of trust and relationship.
And if you talk to
otherwise it's not possible, it's not physically possible, because we saw that when last 20 years with U.S. ingress into Afghanistan invasion, how difficult it was for them to finish their dependency on Pakistan, which was problematic for them, the G-locks and the airlocks, and move to the northern supply route, which was, again, they had to, and how difficult it was to negotiate with Russia and those states to open that space without having a relationship of trust with them. So that is understandable there with the whole Eurasianism.
I think for China, I mean, in the early stages of the launch of the BRI, Russia was the big worry, actually. Russia was the country where, if they were not positively disposed, which they were not initially, I mean, Crimea made a difference to that, made them much more willing to accept certain forms of investment. I mean, it changed the balance of it considerably, but they were very careful. I mean, China honestly did not go around consulting with that many countries with the Belt and Road. They kind of announced it and then said,
went in through money in some of the smaller countries, and here it is.
Russia was an exception. Russia, they did go and talk in some depth about these questions of transit routes, because, I mean, of course, Russia wanted to make sure precisely that the important transit routes went through Russia, through Russia and Belarus and things like this, rather than the kind of more complicated routes through Central Asia. But even the Central Asia routes required a certain degree of Russian blessing as far as China was concerned.
You couldn't do it without, they could have jeopardized it and shaken it up in a day if they wanted to.
And so I think, I mean, this kind of, the Eurasia question, what happens in the drawdown of the US? I mean, if the US is vacating an entire
the onshore
zone,
powers and the offshore power, I mean, that space. And so India, in that sense.
So then this is again, it's still tricky for India, because it's been operating in this space where it's not only that the dynamics with China and Pakistan and these things, it's the fact that Russia has often been the kind of bridge actor for them for certain kinds of role. I mean, it's Russia that pulls them into the SCO.
Yeah.
Russia that makes sure that they're attending some of these things, so they're not attending all of these things. But if there's an actor that speaks up for India, it's been Russia in that sense. And so, the question then of how far to in a context where they're uncomfortable in some sense with what's happening in Ukraine, but it's
I'm
not
sure
materially.
Not.
It's not something where they necessarily feel obliged to come out and take strong positions. Maintaining a certain quality of relationship with Russia is still important for them, and China's kind of seen a certain opportunity there, and there's a wider opportunity for China, which has just been across the developing world. There are still countries that want to trade with Russia. There are still and China is in different ways potentially able to help facilitate that. I mean, you're seeing certain things that People's Bank of China is able to do. I mean, Russia's operating under very straitened conditions. Lots of people are still buying energy from Russia. Lots of people are buying other things from Russia.
Rubles is strengthened remarkably.
Through all sorts of
maneuvering, but
complicated internal means that means it's a bit fragile as well. But certainly there's this kind of, can China stitch together a coterie of countries in the developing world that still want certain economic interactions with Russia, and where China is, in a sense, their own interactions look less problematic if they're done in concert with others. And to some extent this, how do you build a sanctions-proof architecture? They can't do it yet, but long term they want that. And so these are the spaces where they can kind of poke at a little bit. I think the problem with India is if you hadn't had what happened on the border, then it would have been, India and China have at points cooperated on climate issues, on WTO. There have been various global points in which the fact that they're two large developing countries has meant they can find some real common ground on these things.
And both the countries trying to find their space in the global kind of power boys club, basically. Both China's already there very much, but India rising very, very quickly also.
But this has meant, just the challenges. What played out on the border was so bad. This was not a normal set of border clashes. So the kind of this line that things have to be fixed. The Chinese position on this is essentially we can now just park what happened, move on, deal with other issues. And from the Indian perspective, this was a shredding of all the agreements that had been in place, the entire architecture to manage the border for a long time that had worked quite successfully.
Worked quite well.
It had been they'd been able to navigate these issues, and now they see essentially China saying, "Okay, we've consolidated our position here. Now let's move on." And with, there has been no fix of any of the outstanding issues around this.